Hey, my friends, I'm back to read Module 9 for you. Are you ready? We're on page 261, and I'm going to read for probably about 25 minutes, something like that. All right, you ready? Module number 9, Evolution. Part Scientific Theory, part Unconfirmed Hypothesis. Introduction. In 1859, Charles R. Darwin published a book entitled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Typically referred to as The Origin of Species, Darwin's book caused a firestorm in the scientific community. In his book, Darwin proposed a theory that attempted to explain the diversity of life that exists on Earth. This theory, now known as the theory of evolution, made no reference to God. Instead, it proposed that the same kinds of processes which we see occurring today are in fact responsible for all of the species on the planet. In effect, Darwin's book proposed to answer the age-old question, how did we get here? Without ever referring to a supernatural creator. This sent shockwaves throughout the scientific community because at that time, science inseparably linked to God. Most scientists were formally trained in the Bible. Many were, in fact, clergy of the church. Back then, it was common for scientific publications to mention God and the Bible often and with reverence. The very idea, then, that Darwin proposed a theory that did not refer to or require God was astonishing. To some, it was horrendous. They could not imagine a scientist who didn't refer to God as a natural part of his scientific inquiries. To others, it was what they had wanted for a long time. They did not believe in God. And finally, an idea had come along that told them how we came to be without referring to anything supernatural. Sadly, Darwin's theory, with ample modifications, has become the standard explanation for the origin of life on this planet. As you'll see in this module, however, it is not because of the scientific evidence. Based on the scientific method that we discussed in module number 1, the important part of Darwin's theory never really left the stage of being a hypothesis. Nevertheless, the majority of scientists today consider his theory to be a scientific law. Why is this the case? Hopefully, that is one of the questions this module will answer for you. Before we begin discussing Darwin and his theory, however, we need to point something out. There are many ways that people of faith have approached the theory of evolution. On one end of the spectrum, there are those who assume that it must be true, since the majority of scientists today believe in it. As a result, they try to make the scriptures of their faith consistent with it. In the case of Christians and Jews, for example, this means trying to interpret the first few chapters of Genesis in such a way as to allow for the process of evolution. On the other end of the spectrum, there are those who refuse to even consider the theory because it runs counter to what they believe Scripture teaches. Christians and Jews on this end of the spectrum, for example, will not even consider the theory because their interpretation of the first few chapters of Genesis flatly contradicts the theory of evolution. Of course, there are many people between these two ends of the spectrum attempting to either integrate the idea of evolution into their faith on one level or another, or rejecting part or all of the theory because it's considered incompatible with their faith. Who is right? What is the proper way to view the theory of evolution in the light of faith? We will not answer those questions. Clearly, we have very strong ideas on how Christians should approach the theory of evolution, but we do not think that such opinions belong in a science textbook. Questions of scripture interpretation and fundamental dogma should be left to other more theological works. Instead, we choose to approach evolution strictly from a scientific perspective. We will examine the theory and see where it stands in the light of current scientific knowledge. Charles Darwin. Because he is such an important figure in the field of biology, it is necessary to look at the life of Charles Darwin in some detail. This will help us gain insight into how he developed his theory, and hopefully you might learn a lesson or two from his story. Charles Robert Darwin was born in the village of Shrewsbury, England on February 12, 1809. On that same day, far away, Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky. Darwin was born into a relatively wealthy family where education and artistic enrichment were stressed. In 1825, he enrolled at the University of Edinburgh, where all the men in his family had been educated. His father wanted him to study medicine, but he was sickened at the first sight of surgery being performed without anesthesia. He also showed little aptitude for the subject, so after 2 years, he abandoned the study of medicine. When he left the study of medicine, he transferred to Christ's College in Cambridge, England, to study theology. Contrary to what you might have read or heard about Darwin, he seemed to be a deeply committed Christian at this point in his life. During this part of his life, he said that he did not, quote, in the least doubt the strict and literal truth of every word of the Bible, end quote. Since he considered himself a devout Christian, the study of theology came quite naturally to him, and he graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Theology, Euclid, and the Classics. Although his degree was in theology, Euclid, and the Classics, Darwin developed a keen interest in theology while at Cambridge. Thus, when he had the opportunity to accompany a Cambridge professor, Adam Sedgwick, on a geology field trip in the summer of 1831, he jumped at the chance. While on that field trip, he was offered the position of naturalist on the HMS Beagle, a ship that planned to circumnavigate the globe. Although you might think it unusual for a ship to employ a naturalist, every ship had such a position available. Darwin eagerly accepted the assignment, and that voyage changed both Darwin's life and the face of science forever. Before that voyage, Darwin had read a book written by Thomas Malthus entitled An Essay on the Principles of Population. In this book, Malthus said that all individuals within a population struggle against other individuals to obtain what is necessary: food, shelter, a mate, etc., in order to survive and reproduce. While on board the HMS Beagle, Darwin also read some of the works of a controversial geologist named Sir Charles Lyell. Lyell was one of the first scientists who rejected the history of the world as told in the Old Testament and tried to show that the same processes we see at work today could, given eons and eons of time, produce all the geological features in the world. Geologists often summarize Lyell's idea with the catchphrase, quote, "The present is the key to the past," end quote. Darwin voyaged on the HMS Beagle for 5 years. During that time, he made many observations. Each time the ship dropped anchor, Darwin collected samples and made observations of the species native to whatever island or landmass he was on. These observations, some of which we will detail later, combined with the ideas of Malthus and Lyell, led Darwin to formulate his theory, which he called natural selection. Although his theory was completely formulated by the time he left the HMS Beagle, he did not publish his book for another 23 years. Part of the delay was due to Darwin trying to perfect his work, but most of it was due to his wife, who recognized the devastating effect that his work could have on the church. She pleaded with him not to publish, and he respected her wishes for some time. But in the end, he felt that he had to communicate his ideas to the scientific world. He therefore published The Origin of Species in 1859. It is important to note that Darwin was a careful, meticulous scientist. He was not the anti-religion crusader that many have made him out to be. If you actually read his work, you will find that it is quite even-handed. Indeed, Darwin devoted more space to discussing the reasons a scientist might not want to accept his main hypothesis than he did to the discussion of why a scientist should accept it. You will not find that kind of even-handedness in the majority of scientific writing that occurs today. Indeed, modern scientists, especially evolutionary crusaders, could learn a lot from Darwin's style. Darwin's only real mistake was to allow his faith to erode as a result of the science he pursued on the HMS Beagle. The best illustration of how Darwin's faith eroded while on the HMS Beagle and the years after can be found by comparing two statements he made. During the earliest part of his voyage, he wrote in his diary that he often bore the brunt of a good deal of laughter. Quote, from several of the officers for quoting the Bible as final authority on some moral point. End quote. Only a few years after his voyage, however, he stated that, quote, the Old Testament, from its manifest false history of the world, with the Tower of Babel, the rainbow as a sign, etc., etc., and from its attributing to God the feelings of a revengeful tyrant, was no more to be trusted than the sacred books of the Hindus, or the beliefs of any barbarian. End quote. Clearly, these are the statements of a man whose faith at first seemed strong, but then eroded over time to nothing. Charles Darwin died in 1882 as the result of a long illness. He died a celebrated naturalist whose views were said to usher in a new age of science. He was buried in Westminster Abbey along with such scientific greats as Sir Isaac Newton and Lord William Thomson Kelvin. There is a myth going around the Christian community that Darwin recanted his theory on his deathbed. This is a lie, and historians think that it was started by the widow of Sir James Hope, Fleet Admiral for the Royal Navy. She claims to have visited Darwin shortly before his death and to have heard him recant his theory and asked to be told how he might be saved. Darwin's own daughter, Henrietta, however, said, quote, the Admiral's widow was not present during his last illness or any illness. I believe he never even saw her, end quote. In addition, She states that, quote, he never recanted any of his scientific views, either then or earlier. The whole story has no foundation whatever, end quote. Although the story of a deathbed recantation by Darwin is appealing to Christians, it is almost certainly a lie, and therefore such a story does not in any way honor God. Although this biography was rather long and involved, it was necessary for 4 reasons. First, it is important that the phony story of Darwin's deathbed recantation not be spread any further. Second, it is important for you to realize that although Darwin's theory has had devastating effects on the faith of many people, Darwin himself was not an anti-religion crusader like many evolutionists are today. Darwin was a careful, dedicated scientist who started his career speaking like a Bible-believing Christian. There is not a shred of evidence that he had any intentions of harming the church. He was merely communicating what he thought were the obvious conclusions of science. Third, it shows that even careful use of the scientific method can result in the wrong conclusion. Despite the fact that Darwin did everything right in terms of the science that he did, we can show that although a portion of his theory is valid, the major conclusion is not. Thus, proper use of the scientific method does not guarantee a correct answer. Finally, a look at Darwin's life can show you how horrible the results are when you put your faith in science. As we stated in module number 1, science is limited and is constantly changing. What we thought were scientific laws less than a century ago are now known to be wrong. Indeed, as you will see in the rest of this module, we now know that most of Darwin's ideas were very wrong. You simply cannot put your faith in something as limited and subject to change as science. Had Darwin realized that, he would not have allowed his faith in the Bible to be eroded, and he might have never championed this errant theory that has had such a devastating effect on the faith of others. Okay, that is part 1 of module 9. I'll see you in a little bit with part 2 that begins with Darwin's theory. Thanks, friends. Thanks for listening.